Hello. Welcome everyone to how to use alumni engagement metrics to drive results. And we're very happy to have you joining us today and appreciate you taking time from your busy schedules. My name is Kimberly. I'm part of the QGIve team. And if you haven't had the opportunity to work with us before, we are an online fundraising platform dedicated to helping nonprofits raise more money. And part of how we do that is through webinars like this one today. So today's webinar will be just about 45 minutes with a Q&A session to follow, keeping our total time together to just about an hour. We will be recording the presentation and sending each of you a follow-up email, which will include a recording of today, a copy of the presentation, as well as some links to some great resources. So please be on the lookout for that in your email box tomorrow. And we are live tweeting highlights for the webinar today, and that's hashtag QGiveWebinar. So if you are a Twitter user, please follow us and join the discussion. Our username is QGive. If you have questions at any point, please go ahead and put them into the questions box, and our presenter, Jenny, is ready to answer and discuss those during our Q&A portion that follows. And very important, after today's webinar, as you are hanging up, you're going to be prompted to complete a short 4-question survey. So your feedback is very crucial in determining future content for webinars and other resources. So we really encourage you to take that survey. So before diving into today's presentation, let's just take a quick peek at QGive's background, mission, and offerings. QGive has been helping nonprofit organizations implement and grow their online fundraising programs since 2007. And as the importance of online giving has grown, our mission has remained the same, and that is to help others fulfill their passion to make a difference. And we do that through a comprehensive suite of fundraising tools featuring donation forms, event registration, peer-to-peer fundraising, text giving with outbound messaging, and auction events. So today we are excited to introduce you to Jenny Cooke Smith, Director of, and you're going to have to tell me, is it AMA or AM Atlas?
AM Atlas, yes.
AM Atlas Services for CASE. And Jenny specializes in analyzing advancement, interpreting comparison benchmarks, helping people understand stories, and she's going to tell you so much more. So over to you, Jenny.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kim. And let me just go ahead and share my screen. Great. Well, so excited to be with all of you today. And as Kim said, my role at CASE is really overseeing our AM Atlas services. And I'll talk momentarily about what AM Atlas means. But what I want you to know is that I think of my role as helping facilitate our CASE members get value through data. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about today, and primarily thinking about that in the context of the alumni engagement metrics. So our session today, I've put it in really sort of 3 main sections. We'll first start by introducing you to some of the work that we're doing at CASE around advancement metrics, focusing on an introduction for the alumni engagement metrics, which is one of the newer surveys at CASE. I want to make sure everybody feels really comfortable with some of the goals and hopeful outcomes as we look to use and establish engagement metrics for the industry. We'll then focus our conversation on what are we learning so far? What have been the 2021 findings? And we're going to share some preliminary numbers there. And then what are the takeaways as we start to understand alumni engagement metrics? Finally, we'll shift our conversation and talk about a couple of things. One, QGive has done some really excellent research that aligns quite nicely with some of the data that I'm presenting to you today. So we'll bring in some of that research in the context of thinking about what's next. And by that, I mean what's next for this survey, and also what you can think about in your own programs in terms of what's next in using the results. So as I promised, I'd like to tell you just a little bit more about the work that we're doing. And so I always tell people when you hear AM Atlas, what I really want you to think about is research, benchmarking analysis, because that's really what our division is focused on at CASE. And so we do this through several different ways. We're going to be focusing today on that sort of light blue ball, and that is our alumni engagement metrics. And you're going to hear all about alumni engagement metrics, but I will say that's actually the first initiative that we've done to collect data globally that is really the same, so that we can really start to use this to understand where are trends that might be more specific to a certain area, and where are things that are happening no matter where we are in the globe. As we go, I'm going to go counterclockwise across our circle for a moment, and talk about the philanthropy metrics. So many of you are probably incredibly familiar with the philanthropy metrics that we have through CASE, and that's because you probably first and foremost will recognize the Voluntary Supportive Education Survey. That is a survey that's been in existence for 64 years, I believe now, and is really seen as the authoritative source on higher education philanthropy. In addition to that survey, we are also doing research in Canada, UK, Ireland, and Australia, New Zealand, and are beginning to pilot measures that would work across the globe, no matter what country institutions are in, and also no matter what type of institution you're with, whether that's an international school or a very large university. Continuing on our counterclockwise journey, we also do spend a lot of time thinking about, as our industry evolves, how do we make sure we're providing you the data that you need? One of those is doing a lot of research around developing metrics for marketing and communications. And I would say we're very much in our pilot stages on that. Another good example is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging research. We're at the stage where we're trying to understand, where does it become a through line through all of the surveys and research we're doing, and where are places that should live on its own. And a good example is we've just done a pilot study with UK, specifically collecting some research around diversity within advancement shops. And then finally, we have also launched a study on campaign metrics, and that's really looking at when institutions either are launching or closing out of a campaign, collecting some key data points that really will establish transparency and accountability in campaign counting, so that we can really have some great comparison measures. And since today's topic is primarily about alumni engagement, I'll say that even includes things like, what are the goals that are part of your campaign that might not be that ultimate dollar goal? And certainly engagement is something that we've continued to see as a trend. Before we move on, I do want to call your attention to that bright sunshine yellow middle, and that is our CASE Global Reporting Standards. We released these last year. It's the first edition of Global Reporting Standards, and this is really monumental for our industry because it is setting a set of ethical considerations and counting practices that are, again, are global in nature for our profession. And that really governs all of the elements of our research. So with that in mind, what I thought might help our conversation today around engagement metrics was to shed a little bit of light on what we saw for 2021 specific to philanthropy. And then we'll talk about what we're seeing in the world of engagement. And so we've just really released the 2021 findings. So as a reminder, this will be on fiscal year 21. So for most of our institutions, that's going to be through the end of June of last year. And what we saw was that, as you can see, we raised the higher education as an industry received 43 billion, or excuse me, 53 billion, and that it stems from, there was a lot of stories to the data in 2021, and I've highlighted a few of those here. I will actually show you a couple slides on alumni support because I think that's really pertinent to our conversation. But I will add that one of the headline numbers were, you know, gifts to really historically underfunded institutions. And, one of the things we saw is that incredibly generous philanthropists like Mackenzie Scott really did actually move the needle when we started to look at those philanthropic trends. We also saw, and we honestly see this in every year for the past few years, but 2021 was no different, which was a number of gifts that were over 100 million that really helped elevate towards that 53 million. Of those, 8 were to research doctoral institutions, and a little bit more unusual, one of those was actually to a private baccalaureate liberal arts institution. And then really correlating with the wealthy philanthropist piece that you see, we saw a very unprecedented growth in unrestricted giving. And we certainly feel that probably that had a lot to do with those Mackenzie Scott gifts. We also saw an increase in giving to restricted endowments. Probably some of that is based on strategy, as some institutions focused their 2021 ask more on direct operating costs for students. And so now we're sort of flipping to a little bit more of a typical distribution. And so, again, I mentioned this, that alumni gave more in 2021 than 2020. You're going to see that when we look at the engagement metrics as well, from a donor standpoint, but this is looking at it from a dollar standpoint. And we can see that, in fact, every donor type actually gave more in 2021. And as we look at this over time, I just wanted you to get an idea before we pivot and we really spend the rest of our session focusing on alumni results to see sort of how that's influenced these philanthropy trends over time. And notice that our sort of broken yellow line here is representative of the money coming from alumni. And more specifically, we're looking at the percentage of dollars that's generated from alumni. And you can see that uptick in 2021. You can also see that point where alumni and foundations actually crossed and foundation giving overtook alumni. Do keep in mind that when we collect the dollar figures to avoid double counting, we are looking at everything from a hard credit standpoint. So we certainly know that there are a number of gifts within this total that would have been on behalf of alumni that actually were given to the foundation. And when we talk about the giving portion of the alumni engagement metrics, that's actually why when we look at who is giving, so the donor count, we do include both hard and soft credit totals. So that was just a quick foray into what was happening in the world of philanthropy in 2021. We're going to shift and focus now on the alumni engagement metrics. Now, I know that some of you are probably quite familiar with this survey, and some of you might actually have been involved in the inception of this, because this has really been a true collective movement from many, many institutions. So I told you that this is one of our newer surveys. In fact, this was the 3rd year of data collection. And one of the things I really love about getting to spend time with so many of you is learning that we're actually on sort of a very similar point in this journey throughout the whole industry. So even if you're a very, very large, well-sourced institution, you probably are still doing a lot of work to capture engagement metrics. And we'll talk a bit about this today. And I would say if you're here today and you feel like you're just beginning that journey, the good piece of that means that's great, because no one else is terribly far along. So you're not playing the catch up that you think you might be doing. So with this project, the goal was really to establish a definition, some definitions, and I'm going to show you a couple of those, and a framework to measure engagement in the same way. I have been working with higher education institutions for most of my career. And I've specifically been in rooms with a number of annual giving professionals for the last upwards of 15 years. And one of the things that would always come up is, how do we measure engagement in a way that we can really see this in the same light. And I think what we did is just scratched our heads on that for about a decade. And then in 2018, a couple of things happened. Really, case listened. Many of you as members and volunteers were coming to us and saying, this is a problem. And so the Alumni Relations Commission, which is a group of volunteers, formed a task force and said, go and figure this out. And I'm going to show you exactly what they figured out, because the result of that is this survey and these metrics. The other thing that happened in 2018 is that our case CEO and president, Sue Cunningham, penned an op-ed to Inside Higher Ed that basically said, hey, this uber focus on donor participation rate is really silly and outdated and not the right measure. And this was, of course, in reference to the chasing of donor participation rates to help with the US News and World Report rankings. They listened. It's actually a big reason why that percentage is now 3% of the ranking versus 5% as it was previously. And I can tell you that, their real response was, that's great. We have nothing else to help understand affinity. And so as you're thinking about this measurement, this is really about establishing a more accurate measure of alumni affinity. And we're certainly in talks with US News and World Report and thinking about when we get to that point, and a lot of that is volume, and also a couple of years without any changes to the metrics to make sure we've got the right thing, to really get to a place where we replace it with this better measure. So with that expository information aside, a couple of the key definitions. So we actually first had to figure out, what are we even talking about when we talk about alumni? Because we found many institutions define this really differently. And so as you can see, we established more of a wide net here and really said alumni are people that are interacting with our institutions to learn. And that might be a very short interaction. They just attended, they didn't actually graduate. It may be they got a certificate. They never actually came on campus, but they still had that interaction. And we'll see in the survey that because of that, we do have specific categories to learn further. The other really crucial definition was then saying, okay, we know who, now what does it mean to be engaged? And I think I'm quite proud of this definition, but what I want to call your attention to are the words mutually beneficial relationships. I think that's a real differentiator when we start to talk about engagement versus just counting gifts with philanthropy. A lot of our key influences in putting this out really said, hey, it's not just what are our alumni doing for our institutions, but how are we in turn inspiring loyalty to really build that virtuous circle? So with those definitions in place, we then assigned that framework. And the framework looks at these 4 modes. And so we are essentially asking for counts of alumni engaged philanthropically. As I mentioned before, all we really care about here is counts of alumni donors, and that can be hard or soft credit, through volunteerism. So we do have a really robust guidance document that literally walks through all of the activities that would count or not count as part of this survey. So for purposes of today, I'll just say we're essentially looking at formally defined volunteer roles here. The green box, experiential. So this is where we're talking about things like attending events, so both virtual and in person, looking at all those sort of virtual interactions online, like perhaps your digital book forums, etc., your season ticket holders. And then also for those of you that have dues paying alumni association memberships, that's where you'd count those members as well. So I purposefully left communication until the end for a couple of reasons. One, it's totally the murkiest. It's the one that we knew would be the trickiest in trying to collect this information. And that actually leads me to my second point. And that is why we have a short version of this survey. It is actually optional if you take the short survey to skip communication, with the hope that we get to a stage where everyone's able to capture it. But for now, we felt like that was really probably the right way to go. And I'll show you some data to support that in a couple of slides. So what's communication? This is going to include all of the social pieces. So you can imagine, again, that does involve typically working with a vendor to be able to capture that data. And even then, we know we are not getting everything. It is going to involve some more traditional communication, such as submitting data updates or responding to an alumni attitudinal survey. And then the piece that we added in the second year of the survey, so we now have 2 years of data on, will be clicking through on an email. So not getting an email, that's actually not communication, that's just receiving. But actually taking that interaction where it becomes interactive. And so that's where the clicking through, if you're capturing alumni who are doing that, then that would count within this bucket. So we're collecting this data and we're absolutely going to start to look at how these pieces interact. But at the very base level, what we'll be doing is then coming up with an engagement rate. And here you can see the numerator for that being the count of alumni who engaged in at least one of those 4 buckets. And so again, I could be in all 4, I could be in only one, I still count once, divided by your contactable alumni population. And that's where we're going to get that engagement rate overall. So given that, let's look at what we're seeing for the 2021 results. So you can see the percentage of alumni that are engaged by institution type. And what we're sharing with you is the percentage engaged through each of those 4 modes. And then that final set of bar graphs will be the percentage engaged by any of the 4 modes. So as you're looking through these, look at the institution type that you represent, and hopefully this sort of aligns with what you'd probably start to think with this. I don't know if we have anyone here from a community college or not, but I will share a slide with you in a couple of minutes that I think will make you feel a lot better when you look at the size of some of those bars, and it will explain a lot as we start to look at some of these pieces. Do note that the volunteer bar or our set of volunteer bars is really the smallest overall. And that makes sense, I think, for 2 reasons. One, again, many institutions are really just starting to collect volunteerism that's happening outside of advancement and perhaps outside of your boards. And secondarily, when you look at these massive alumni populations, it typically may be just a small amount of volunteer activities that you even have available. So I am starting with, and I think this is the easiest way for me at least to understand and talk about trends, and that is the very, very top. So the sort of surface level information. And so I would like to ask this group, besides that really surface level information, what are other things that you think that you need to know, or that you found that you need to know, and using data to help understand what's happening with engagement? So if you could just take a moment, put it in the chat. I'd love to hear your ideas. So I'll give you all just a minute here. I know somebody's probably got some thoughts around how you're measuring it. Thanks, Angie.
Oh, good. I didn't know if you were seeing it. So you go. You have any?
So yeah, I think you've seen that your alumni with multiple degrees were those that were most engaged. We're going to look at that data in a moment because that is absolutely the trend we've seen nationwide. Any other ideas or anything else anyone's looked at when it comes to engagement? And as I said at the beginning, I think there's really no wrong answers here because this is something that we're all learning together. So Stephanie, you'd like to see some more peer-to-peer comparisons. So curious a little bit about that request. I will talk about some specific peer data we'll provide through case. Masters were least engaged. Interesting, Angie, I've seen that as well. I've seen preferred method of communication and topics. I think that's really important. And we will, again, look at some great data from QGIV about that as well. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to share with you my list I came up with, which again, I think some of this will echo the things we've heard. So at the end of the day, I think we're trying to understand, how do you prioritize? How do you identify the things you're doing well and the things that could be an area for opportunity? And some of that is thinking about, where are you trending up and down, and where did you put your focus and energy? And given that that was a strategy, did it pay off? We'll look at some staffing counts, and I will also tell you that the survey collects information around expenditures. So thinking about resources can be a really good place to start. I did a presentation in Texas earlier this week with an institution that is literally, as they're launching their public phase of the campaign, using these results to make the case that they are woefully understaffed compared to peers. Events, I think, has been a real question, and we'll look at some data around that. And to Dottie's point, I think understanding what messages are working and how are they actually responding and how do they want to see information from you. We're also going to look at the behavior of alumni once they become engaged. And then understanding just how much have you gotten. You know, if you're on the very beginning point of this journey, one of the measurements is probably to look at your own year-over-year success and just simply capturing more. We'll talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about what we can see if we look at things like class year and acquisition, retention, reactivation. So let's get right into it. And the first thing I thought I'd share with you is that idea of year-over-year results. So here you can see, and again, I want to share, this is preliminary 2021 data. We are doing some final cleaning. So when we actually produce our findings report next month, you may see these numbers shift slightly, but I think the trends themselves will hold. And so I'm showing this in a couple of views for you. One will be by country and the other by institution type. And as a heat map, the darker the green will be the highest positive change, the brighter the yellow, the highest negative change, or the most negative change. And so I'll point your attention to, when we looked at philanthropy in the US, you do see that we actually were up in counts of alumni donors. Whoa, that hasn't happened in some time. Unfortunately, I think it was because 2020, we were so far down due to giving days that got pushed out and a whole number of things that we all know as it comes to the pandemic. But I think that it's really exciting to see this notable increase in counts of donors overall. You can see volunteerism was an area that was really up across the board when we looked at different countries, a little bit mixed when we examined that from an institution type perspective. In general, kind of mixed again with experiential. And I think a lot of that makes sense, as we're still, for the most part, with 2020 in a mostly virtual environment. And I'll show you a little bit of data on that momentarily. And then communication, I was actually really happy to see these results, because the year before we had these massive upswings in communication, and it really was because we had allowed that increase of click-through rates. So I think now what we're seeing is a little bit more of a normalized communication number by having those same data points year over year. So a little bit more on events. We do ask, and we actually had a new question this year, simply trying to understand the count of events. And so I'm sharing with you the median count of virtual, of in-person, and hybrid. But what you can see is that when we look at the medians for in-person and hybrid, they're not terribly interesting. And so what I did was I added for you the ranges of those. And then you can see that in many ways, institutions were really across the board when it came to this. Now, as you look at the bottom right and the screen, I've notated that essentially 94% overall of all the events that happened were still virtual only. So I think this is still a question as we think about what does it look like moving forward. We're still a little early on to have that pure data around understanding incorporating virtual and hybrid. Now, speaking of that, I thought I would share some accompanying data from the excellent report that Cooke put out, which was report with navigating the unknown, and that came out. Of course, much earlier on in the pandemic, but this is more of a behavioral perspective around what institutions are planning as they were looking towards 2021. And, I think this whole idea of always having some virtual component is a really interesting one that we're going to have to continue to see how that shakes out over time. So as we think about what were some of the key learnings and understanding this data, one of those is, I think, really exciting from a quantitative we can prove it standpoint. It's probably not terribly surprising. And that was, we looked at the percentage of alumni that were engaged and we said, what percentage of that engagement is actually driven from philanthropy? And I'll just pick on sort of the first dial here. What we saw was that it was about 25%. So a quarter of engagement we were capturing previously when we were just looking at something like donor participation. And to me, this starts to prove that idea that that was nowhere close to a measurement around alumni affinity. And I would suggest that this is something you may want to look at your own shops. Again, this is a moving target because we know you're all collecting more and more engagement information, but I think it can be highly educational as you're thinking about your own program. Now, sort of speaking about this notion of what we can and cannot capture, for me, probably my real epiphany aha moment in this journey was having conversations with many of you and kind of hearing some of the pain points around, gosh, this is hard. And I think more specifically, this is not like counting gifts. And as we embrace that notion, what we decided to do is add this layer of we're not counting, we are measuring. And as you can see here, measuring being let's reduce the uncertainty about the thing we're trying to figure out. And if you're like me, that was just a great sigh of relief because we don't have to boil the ocean here. What we want to do is find out more to help instruct what we should do next. And so, with that idea in mind, in the 2020 survey, and of course, moving forward, we added a required question that said, we're hoping you're confident that you're counting your gifts. So, outside of that mode, tell us how confident are you that the data that you're capturing represents the activities that are happening across your institutions. And so what I'm sharing with you is aggregate responses. And you can see that when we look at something like communication, only about 20% of respondents indicated that they had confidence in their communication numbers. And that actually helps us decide, yep, we're just going to keep this as optional when we look at that short version. So hopefully if you're here today and you're thinking about, gosh, we're nowhere near where we thought we'd be, this may give you some confidence that that's okay, because in some ways, again, everyone's still on that journey. And also, we may never actually capture everything, but having this understanding of how much we think we're getting, I think becomes really important. So I teased out this slide earlier, but I did want to share with you some counts on alumni staffing. This is actually the 2020 results. I did some brief analysis on what we have in 2021, and it doesn't actually look like we've had major changes at the median for staff counts. We certainly saw institutions, some that were up, some that were down. The one thing that I think you should be paying attention to is what's happening with your base of legally contactable alumni. alumni. What we saw is that at the median, that grew by about 3%. That's important because one of the figures that I'd suggest you look at is your legally contactable divided by your count of alumni relations staff. I should say we have some really specific language around alumni relations staff and how to count, a half person or a third person. But we're really trying to get, even if they're not part of your actual alumni relation or your actual alumni association office, people whose duties are alumni relations. So if you look at that third category, what you can see is that the legally contactable counts per staff is vastly different for different institution types. And going back to our community colleges, well, of course, those bars were much smaller because notice on average, we're seeing staff that are responsible for reaching out to 44,000 plus alumni. The last column puts this based on our engaged alumni versus our staff. And this is actually a lot flatter number. And that's exciting to me because that shows if we've got the right resources, we actually can really build towards some of these outcomes. So I think this was Angie's comment earlier, and I think it's a good one because it's something that we've really seen across the board, which is when we looked at this notion of undergraduate only, postgraduate only, or multiple degree, we have seen that navy blue bar, the multiple degree, tend to engage at higher rates than the undergrad only and the postgrad only. And this is actually to your institution. So if they got 2 degrees in different places, they wouldn't count as multiple degree. But if they got more than 1 degree at your institution, in general, they should be engaging at higher rates across all 4 modes. If they're not, boy, you've got some real great opportunities for focusing on that segment there. And then maybe my favorite outcome of understanding the data and looking at how these pieces fit together is examining the percentage of alumni who are engaged and looking if they're also giving. And so what you can see here is that in some ways, communications I think of as a little bit of our gateway drug. And it makes sense. That's probably of the 4, the thing that's not quite like the others. It's a little bit more passive. And so, again, understanding how many are you converting to giving from communications can help you think about, well, maybe is there a different touch point before giving that I really want to try to get my alumni to? You can see that our experiential and volunteerism around 1/3. What I will tell you that you're not seeing here is this was highly distributed. And as we talked to some of the institutions that had some of the higher percentages of giving, in many cases, it was directly correlated to strategies that they were using and goals and outcomes. And I'll give you one example. When we looked at something like experiential, who are who are also giving, one of the things we heard is that for a few institutions, they may have a giving component of the event. And so by nature, you're automatically going to have a high number that fit in that both category. I am not here to say that's good or bad. It's simply part of what we're seeing that's driving those results. We can also flip this question on its head and say what percentage of our donors are engaging in other activities. And we can see that was just under 40%. What I will say to you on this is know this for your own program. And if you find that your alumni who understand what sets them apart, this group of alumni who are giving and engaged, and the alumni who are just giving, which is certainly not a bad thing. But understanding, is their revenue per donor different? Are they tend to be from different types of classes or from different parts of my institution? I think knowing some more there, again, can inform some strategies and plans for this group. So I am going to, in our last few minutes before we open things up for questions, we're going to move into our section thinking about what's next. And so what I am sharing with you are some questions that we've been piloting and that we hope to add to this next iteration of the survey. We felt a real key component was understanding engagement based on when alumni graduated. And so what we've done is some pilot testing on that information. And what we saw is that when we looked at the percentage of alumni who are giving based on when they graduated, that this might be the least surprising graph ever, right? If you've been looking at this data as long as I have, you have seen some version of these stair steps. And so what this is, of course, showing us is that there are much smaller percentages of our more recent alumni giving than our alumni that have been out for much longer. Here's where I think it gets really exciting. And this is the alumni engaging in those other three modes by graduation year. And notice no stair steps, actually no real pattern here. And one of the things I saw as I started to look at that pilot data at the individual level is that we're definitely institutions that actually had the highest percentages clustered in those first two sets of bars here. So I'm really excited as we start to collect this at a wider basis to understand, to start to have some data points that can show, look, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And they absolutely are paying attention and engaging with our institutions. They just might not yet be giving. And since we're talking about the generational data, again, I was really impressed with the research that Cooke has done around the generational giving report. And so just a couple of data points from there that might be helpful for you as you're thinking about what to do next. And that is, seeing what generations said were the areas that they were most passionate about. And the thing that we all love about our own education institutions is that even if you don't see the word education there, we all offer things that fit into these other categories. So using this to think about what's the messaging that may best resonate for my groups can be a really nice way to start to leverage these pieces together. And to, I believe it was Dottie's point earlier, also thinking about when do they want to hear from us? So one of the pieces I really loved in the generational giving report was how often by generation, people said that they wanted to hear from nonprofits and other organizations. And so, this is not just the how often do you want to be asked for a gift, but this is really that how often do you want to hear about what's happening? And again, that virtuous circle as we think about those mutual beneficial pieces. And notice that when we look at our younger generations, our Gen Z and our millennials, that they're both sort of clustered there in that once a month, which is actually more frequent than we're seeing for those older generations. And then as we think about, again, incorporating communication strategies, one of the pieces in that report were what were the things that would essentially turn you off from an organization? What are the reasons you would not give? And so you can see this is actually really colorful because it's quite across the board. We saw some of the same outcomes for all of the generations that we're noticing here. And some of these things we can control, some of the things we can't. But a couple of the things that pop out to me are outdated website, inconsistent communications. Those are absolutely things within our control. Poor social media presence as well. The last piece I wanted to share with you from a data perspective is the additional point we're looking at incorporating into the survey. Unfortunately, I don't have data yet to share with you, and that is because when we started to ask our pilot institutions acquisition and reactivation counts for alumni engagement, we learned that it's really hard to say when someone engaged for the first time with your institution. And so we've gone back to the group and our second year pilot, and we've asked this a little differently. And we've asked for institutions to tell us simply your count of alumni who engaged in 2021 that did not do so in 2020, so that we sort of get a combined reactivation activation rate. And my drawing here is really simply a visualization of the leaky bucket. And if, it's definitely something we often hear about annual giving, but I think it 100% pertains here as well. So we're thinking about knowing that we've got alumni that are going to leak out of our bucket every year because they are disengaging with us. How are you replacing them with alumni that have never engaged and those that are coming back on board? So before we pass things over to you now to ask your questions, I'll just simply say, if you're here and you are a member of CASE, there are some nice ways that you can now go dig further on the data. One of them is we do provide the individual results to this survey, whether you took it or not, to all CASE members and a platform called Data Miner. And if you have no idea what that is, but you want to know, I will put my contact information in the chat. You also see Data Miner at case.org. We will make sure that you get access. Now, if you're here and you're thinking, I think I took the survey, or I know I took the survey, I have good news for you. And that is you actually get a GPS report. That report stands for Graphical Program Summary, and it shows your results visually in interactive form. I'm going to show you a quick example of that. And then lastly, we do customized calls that give you the ability to start to partner a little deeper with CASE. And so with that, we are sharing with you a version where you can pick the peers you want to analyze. And then we do a couple of calls to walk through those results with you. And it's a much deeper analysis of the free report that we provide for participating in the survey. And I think someone who, I can't remember who made the comment earlier, there was a comment around peers. You may have been talking about something different, and we can absolutely clarify that in the Q&A portion. But what I will say is we did build an algorithm that is part of the free GPS report that basically helps figure out who looks most like your institution. And so with that, you can see we look at all the variables noted here. We bump your institution up against everybody that took part, and then we spit out the 5 that look most like you. And in that, then you'll see the report will show your results compared to the top right, which would be your peers, that group that were 5 closest to you, compared to the bottom left, that would be your country results, and the bottom right, our global median. This report we send to you, and we send you a link to say it's ready, but it's in Data Miner. And again, if you're here, you know you did the survey, you don't think that report sounds familiar, let me know. I'm happy to facilitate getting that in your hands. And so as we turn things over to the Q&A portion, I thought I would leave you with a slide that one of our volunteers put together really with her team to help show why it was important that they take part in the survey. And I thought that was sort of a good leave behind as we transition to this Q&A portion.
Hi, Jenny. Are you ready for Q&A?
I am ready. Let's go.
Well, any of you that would like to go ahead and put a question in, I do know that Angie put a comment in, and maybe you can speak to that while we see if there's some questions that come up. Angie had said, wow, that seems very cumbersome to manage tracking who was counted in previous years. So do you?
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, Angie. And again, this is a big reason why we try to test this data before we'd say, okay, we're ready for it. And what I will tell you that we're specifically asking our group is, tell us the count of alumni that engaged in 2020 and the count that also engaged in 2021. So we're trying to do it just in that 2-year period versus, go back all throughout time. So that would be the retention. We looked at reactivation. We literally just said, tell us to engage in 2021 and not 2020. So we're not really trying to concern ourselves like we would if it was annual giving, for example, the SciBonts and all those extra years, just those couple year snapshots. And I think the jury's still out to see if institutions are going to easily be able to provide that data or not. But hopefully that clarification helps.
Well, hopefully, and Angie, if not, go ahead and chime back in.
Yeah.
Stephanie's asked, we were using the definition of communication that CASE previously encouraged, interactive, meaningful, and informative communication with alumni. Has that changed? I'm wondering how a click-through on communication would fit under that. And for social media, what do you do to encourage tracking, likes, comments, shares, etc.? I know there's a couple things in there, so if I need to go slower.
No, I think I got it. You keep me honest, Kim. So that great callback. That definition has not changed. And in fact, when we released the 2020 survey, so going back, almost 2 years, we did a lot of, I would say the number one feedback we got when that survey was released was, what about click-through? What about click-through? What about click-through? This is something that we count in our own institutions. And so we brought that question to our task force and our volunteers, and we had some really robust discussions over should we, shouldn't we? And we also had the open rate as part of that. And it felt pretty most people were on the side of the fence that open rate was probably a bridge too far because our platforms can make just a view look like an open. But what it came down to with click-through rate, where we felt like it still matched the definition, is that a volunteer actually said, well, if someone clicks through on something, there is another action we're taking. So when we think about that interactive component, we actually felt like, yeah, that really does match the definition. So our definition of communication didn't change. I would say our interpretation of it as we moved into that second year is what changed. Now, the question about the social media piece, great question. I am not here today, I promise, to tell anybody that they need to manually go figure out who is liking and commenting. That's not a good use of your time. There are certainly vendors out there that do that. One of the questions we asked this year in the survey, which we're still compiling the responses, was for institutions to tell us which platforms and products they were using to capture, manage, track engagement. And we broke that up into a few categories. So we do have that social media or social listening as part of the categories there. So I think one of the key learnings we're going to probably have as we pull this out is who are the institutions that feel like they have high confidence, and what are the platforms and products they're using to get there. So I think we still have a little bit more research to do to get you some good answers on that part.
Well, hopefully, Stephanie, that helps. If not, chime back in. And we do have a question from Cheryl to confirm the GPS reports will be released next month. Is that right?
That is accurate, Cheryl. Yes.
Okay, those are the only questions that just came in. We did have a couple that were pre-submitted, so I'll go ahead and run to those. And again, if there's some more questions, pop them in there, please. What about engagement for parents or other constituencies? Is CASE doing anything to measure this?
Yeah, so, that was absolutely, if any of you have read the white paper where these definitions were established, you'll actually see we even call that out in there. I would say if you're here today and you're not part of an institution, or maybe you're part of a school and you really focus more on that parent population, I think this is broad enough that you could 100% apply these categories to other constituencies. I will also say that parents will probably be the next piece as we look to tackle this, that, we'll understand, are there some nuances that we might measure a little differently? So certainly, keep us moving and keep us honest there if any of you are looking to engage some of those other constituencies and measure that in a common way.
Okay. Another question that was sent in is, how does the case framework work with our own engagement score?
So I can tell you that I think the original vision was that we might be able to have this framework that ultimately had this really nice weighted score to it. And at the end of the day, to do that in a way that would work globally for all institutions kind of made our heads want to explode. And part of that is if you think about your own volunteer activities, we had people actually literally make a list and we were looking at hundreds and hundreds that didn't always nicely overlap in the Venn diagram. And so given that, one of the things, so we sort of kept this at this broad level of counting. And one of the things that we've heard as we've begun to work with institutions is that for their own scoring, they're really trying to make sure that at least they align with the case measures in their buckets so that they're counting that way and they can do these benchmarks. And then you can do your own weighting for your own score, thinking about your own activities and what are those pieces. So our hope is that we are really part of that process, but we're not going to replace any more sophisticated scores that you might have.
All right. Well, I think that was our last question, unless anyone is in the midst of typing. So at this point, thank you, Jenny, for sharing all of this great information with us today. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Again, we will be emailing out a recording of today, as well as a link to the presentation and some other great resources. If you would like to reach out to the QGIve team or to Jenny, please take note of the contact information that's on this last slide. Don't forget to take the survey, please. And then we hope the information helps you with measuring alumni engagement. And thanks again. We will be in touch. And bye, everybody. Thank you,
Bye.
Jenny.
Thank you, QGIve, for this great opportunity. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.